What's up, Trunk Slayers? It's Monday. That means it's time for Spicy Monday. Today I want to talk a little bit more about conferences, in-person conferences, and just how much money is involved in these events and why that's really fucked up and hurting us. We'll get into that in a minute. But this is the second time I'm recording this because I pulled a Slagle and my microphone was set to the wrong device for the last 28 minutes. So hopefully I can match my intensity that I previously recorded. Let's get into this. I've made videos in the past around some other elements of the conference space. I've talked about how there are too many events. I've talked about how the sort of trifecta of how events are aligned has been shifting in a way many of us don't like. We've talked about some of the gamification of how the money is spent in events and just why nothing is really in anyone's favor. And that theme is going to continue in this video, that there's very little in this current event economy that actually really benefits kind of anyone. The attendees, the vendors, people running the events, like everybody's kind of getting fucked. And I think until the industry wakes up and just has a moment where we recognize that, this is going to keep happening. So let's get into it a little bit. So I figured I would go through and actually put some numbers to give everybody a little bit more perspective here. I don't have the information for every possible event in the space, nor do I wish to go find it. So I used what I had on hand and made some averages. If you go onto Channel Program or CRN's websites, they have great event calendars that list a lot more events that I'm talking about in this video. Those are a good place if you want to try and work this out on your own to get started, but do be aware that you will need to solicit individual event prospectuses to figure out pricing to arrive at these numbers. I'm not outing any vendors in this video or any individual prospectus because I don't think that's cool, and I don't think anybody here is intentionally being villainous. So what I did is I went in and I looked through the events that we had potentially narrowed our list down to for 2024 at 𝗏𝗏, which was 62 events. And of those 62 events, I went into all the ones that I had a prospectus on hand for and didn't have to go looking because I'm lazy. And so I pulled up, I think, 15 different event prospectuses. These events are not all one-timers. Some of them are recurring. Some of them are one-timers. From that, I went and created some averages and then extrapolated a little bit more information I have just based on conversations with other vendors to arrive at some information that I think represents the economic impact of these events. But before we get into all of these numbers that I keep dangling in front of you, I want to qualify the data a little bit. Bear in mind, as I have talked about in previous videos, the bulk of the vendors that are in this space, and when I say this space, I don't mean pure MSP, I mean B2B IT events, because there's definitely some overlap. You think ThreatLocker only goes to events that have stereotypical MSPs at it? No, of course not. And same with a lot of us. Within this space, the average vendor has less than $10 million a year of revenue. In fact, not just the average, probably about 90% of the vendor space has less than $10 million in revenue. That is going to be a really important fact to keep in the back of your head throughout this video. I know a lot of my MSP friends that watch this, your revenue probably sits somewhere between $1.5 to $5 million. So to you, a $10 million company, hey, that's big. It really isn't. It's not that big. I also mention this because a lot of vendors, because they go to so many shows and they have so much appearance of lavish spending, it can cause us, I was an MSP for a long time, to assume they are just tripping over dollars. That is probably not the case, and I think that's important. There's a certain element throughout this entire talk about the difference between wealth and debt. And this entire system is very predatory in that it forces everybody more towards the debt end of the spectrum while maintaining the illusion of wealth. So I want everyone to remember that. Most of the vendors that are exhibiting at these events are making $10 million or less, roughly, in revenue a year. They are not swimming in magical excess profit any more than you are. You're a small business, and it's hard to grow a business to that size. Don't let the handful of vendors when you walk into a vendor hall that have bought half the convention floor make you think that's most people's experience. It's not. And that's important because a lot of the math here you're going to find out does not add up for vendors who are in that addressable area. Okay, so let's actually get into it. So events, if you've never really looked at an event prospectus, and many of you may not have, events typically have, I would say, 4 tiers. So it's very common in the event space to have a precious metal tiering, bronze, silver, gold style thing. And then usually there are 2 outside of the band tiers. There's usually a startup tier and a I literally want to light my money on fire tier. For the sake of this video, the light my money on fire tier, we're just going to kind of carve out and put over to the side and not really talk about. Those tiers are not really based in reality and really are only open to a very, very narrow segment of the market. It doesn't really count. We're going to go put that to the side. And the startup tier we're going to talk about first, because I think that's where a lot of this trouble starts happening. One other final detail I want to mention. When I went in and compiled this data, I looked at just the rote cost of sponsoring typically a booth at an event. There are other ways to sponsor events, and many of those require you already have a booth. So you can spend even more money than I'm talking about in this video. I just didn't bother with any of that because it's too complicated. So the idea here is you are literally looking to get a booth tier sponsorship and whatever comes with that throughout the course of the video. Yes, some events you can sponsor more. You'll see hopefully by the end of the video why that's ridiculous. So if I take a relatively small vendor who wants to start exhibiting at shows, it is not unreasonable they will try to apply for a startup tier. Usually startup tier, or whatever the event calls it, has some sort of rules. There's usually some sort of revenue cap. You have to have been in business for a relatively short amount of time, and likely you can only fit the startup tier usually once at most of these. Like, they'll let you do it one time. First hit's discounted, you know, get you hooked on the system. So let's talk about the startup tier first, because keep in mind that you can't stay in it, and you'll see how already warped the system is for that. So we have somebody who's going to go to an event, a vendor, and I had said that we have been looking at 62 events a year at 𝗏𝗏. We're not going to go to 62 events. So let's say this is a modest size vendor that is not swimming in cash, not swimming in employees. So they say, you know what, we're going to go to 6 events in a year. That's all we can afford to do. That's roughly 1 every other month. And they're going to send only 2 people to work the event. So, you know, booth people, whatever, because once again, the opportunity cost at a vendor of this size, it doesn't make sense to send 5 or 6 people to every show, but a lot of them do. So keep that in the back of your head. So we're only sending 2 people, and we're tasking those people with being conservative about what they spend when they're at the show. So we're really assuming the value of these 2 people beyond their time and opportunity cost is travel expenses, hotel expenses. They're going to try to eat at the show and not eat out. They're not co-sponsoring any sort of dinner or party. They're not taking their partners out. They're not bringing people to the Capitol Grill. They're trying to spend as little money as possible. So we're going to say that it costs this vendor about $2,000 an employee for your typical like 3-ish day event for the cost of the employee to be there at 2 employees. So $4,000. Keep that in the back of your head. So my average booth price for a startup tier vendor, remember, you probably only do this one time, is $8,000 for an event. Some are lower. There are some that are lower. Some as low as $2,500. There's some that are much higher. But the average, $8,000 for an event. We add in the employees, $12,000 to sponsor 1 startup tier level event for that vendor. Now, there are different metrics you can go by, but generally it's accepted in the B2B world everywhere, not just tech, that marketing should probably be somewhere between 2 to 5% of your revenue. And since we already go to a lot more events than other industries do in this industry, we're going to go for 5%. So that means that if they do 6 events a year at that startup tier, that's $72,000 a year that vendor has to spend. And for that to be 5% or less of their revenue, that vendor needs to be making at least $1.4 million a year in revenue. And they can't spend any other dollars on marketing. Remember that, because there are other costs. Somebody has to make the booth, the logos, the art, the swag, any other marketing they do the rest of the year, no budget for that. All of it is spent only on going to the events with basically a blank booth because can't spend any money on anything. Already you can see that if that's supposed to be a startup tier pricing and somebody's going to go to 6 events in a year at that startup tier banding, they already need to be, as a startup, at almost $1.5 million in revenue. MSPs, I think your sales cycle's a little longer, but how hard and how long did it take you to get to $1.5 million in revenue, right? So it's not exactly like all the vendors you know and love are already at this point. But remember, we said that a vendor who wants to start doing events, they can't keep doing startup tier events. So let's say your first year, you managed to find 6 startup tier events that you all go to, you spend that $72K your first year, and hey, good for you. Year 2, you're going to do 6 events again, but you don't qualify for startup anymore because you used them last year. So now you have to start at a bronze level. The average bronze level, or really like the normal entry level for everyone else, $23,000 per event for the booth. $23,000. Remember, that's not counting any other costs. If I add employees, $27,000 for one event. 6 events a year, that's $162,000 I have to spend. And if that's going to be 5% of my revenue, I need to be making $3.2 million a year. I want you to think about that. So year 1, I qualified as a startup, and 5% of my revenue put me at $1.4 million. I now need, if I want to maintain the same presence at the same addressable entry-level booth buy-in, basically, which is now bronze for me. I can't do startup anymore. I need to have doubled my revenue in a year. Find me someone in this space who's capable of doing that. Right. It's not really realistic or easy. So, it's one of 2 things, but dramatic foreshadowing, it probably means that I'm spending more than 5% of my revenue now on events. That's probably not too healthy. Let's kick it up a notch. So if I get to silver tier, the average silver tier booth, which is sort of the middle tier, that's $35,600. With employees, that's almost $40,000. That's almost $237,000 a year. That means I need to have at least $4.7 million in revenue to maintain that 5%. Say we get up to gold tier. All right, these are what we normally see, the people who want to have a big presence but don't want to buy half the room typically are at this tier. Average is $56,000 an event. And bear in mind, there's a couple of big events that we consider to be staple events that I don't have the prospectus handy for, that I know for a fact will pull that number way up. So that number is probably a little bit low. $56,000 plus those 2 employees, $60K, $360,000 a year. I need to be at $7.2 million in revenue for me to do 6 events during the year. 6 events during the year for my event spending only to be 5% of my revenue. No other dollar spent on marketing. That's fucking crazy. And it puts me damn near close at only 6 events a year to being at the upper end of the majority of all vendors in our space. So I need to be extremely fucking well run and profitable to have that level of revenue already. Just to give you an idea, if we start getting into the lunatic tiers where shit is expensive, we are averaging $80K just for a booth. Just for a booth. That means, we go through all the math again, that's about $500,000 a year at the lunatic tier in order to be able to afford to do this. I need about a $10 million company, which already pushes me out of the banding of almost all vendors. But wait, I hear you say, I go to more shows than that, or I've seen more shows than that, and I know that my favorite insert vendor here goes to more than 6 shows a year. They won't shut the fuck up about it on social media. You're right, dear viewer. So let's take a look at this with a little bit more reality applied. So there's this interesting thing with events. We've talked about in the past that events typically do 2 things for vendors. There's some other things it does, but typically it's either a lead gen source, it's not a very good one, or an event is more of a way to just sort of establish brand awareness and relevancy. Now, the challenge with the brand awareness and relevancy part is you need to be seen somewhat consistently, or it becomes obvious you're not being seen until you get forgotten. So you probably, if that's part of your goal, and which is probably the goal of many vendors that are sitting somewhere in the middle of that 1 million to 10 million in revenue range, you kind of want to show up at more than 6 things a year because you want to be seen as being out there and being able to be seen. Remember, it's that debt versus wealth concept again. So let's see what this looks like if I averaged 1 event a month. So 12 events a year. Well, at my startup tier, that already brings me to $168,000 a year if I'm doing 12 events, which means that if this is going to be 5% of my revenue, 3.3 million has to be my total revenue, which already knocks me out of the banding at most events for being eligible for the startup tier. See where that's fucked up? Yeah. So let's go over to the bronze tier, which we said is the real entry level after you're not a startup. It's $348,000 a year. That's 6.9 million. So right away, we know that somebody who in the startup tier, if they had to be under $2 million in revenue last year because they're a startup, and now this year has to be bronze, they definitely did not go from being a sub $2 million company to a $7 million fucking company. They're not doing that. And if they are doing that, I want a job because you're literally printing fucking money and I'd like some of it. So given that that's impossible, the only solution here is to over fucking spend, is to overspend more and more of your revenue on this horse shit. And it gets worse. At tier 2 silver sponsorship, we're almost at a 9.9 million. This is a $10 million company now that's going to do 12 events a year and keep event spending at 5% of their revenue. If you get to the gold tier, that's a 14, almost $15 million company. And if we get into the crazy person territory, that's a $20 million plus company if they're going to keep it at 5%, which means no one is able to keep it at 5%, which means people are spending a massive amount of their revenue on just these events. And remember, these events are not the sum total of their fucking marketing. It's just a piece. And so far, we've been telling employees not to spend any other money at these events. If we actually treat it like a real event where you're spending money on swag, taking people out for dinner, the partner experience, co-branding parties and shit like that, this starts getting close to some cases, probably 30-40% of a company's revenue. It's out of goddamn fucking control. So why do we even give a shit? If you're an MSP and you're watching this, what do you fucking care? And if you're a vendor that can afford to do this, why do you care? And if you're a vendor that can't afford to do this, why does anyone care? Well, I'll tell you why everybody should care. It's fucking the entire system up. And it is a house of cards that will tumble. And when it tumbles, everybody loses. Everybody. There will be nobody here that's left as the winner. Go back a minute ago to where we talked about how events tend to fall into one of 2 extremes, and then there's a scale in between. There are your events, we've mentioned this in other videos, that are a profit center. They make money for the people hosting the event, sometimes quite a bit. Then there are events at the other end that are truly run as a non-profit, that likely don't make any money. If they're well run, they break even, that are there for whatever goal they're trying to serve, usually something educational. So if those are the 2 bookends and everything falls in the middle, the challenge is the minute you actually burst the bubble on this economy, everything stops. There are no more dollars to be spent on any of these events. And we keep getting more and more and more events. And all of these events have people that are hunting for vendors to spend their money on those events to prop up either it being free to MSPs or to it being a profit center or anything in the spectrum in between. Now, that might not be the end of the world if this same event economy was also growing its client base, but it's not. It's about the 20% of the North American MSP population are roughly who goes to events. And the thing is, it's kind of the same fucking 20%. It's the same lists over and over again with the same companies and the same people. So I know that it's the same people for two reasons. First of all, because I go to these events and I get the lists, and then I go to add people on LinkedIn, and it's people I've already added over and over and over again. So that's one way that I know. And then the other way that I know is I hang out in places online that have the other 80% of the MSP space in them. And I know for a fucking fact that the event vendors don't go there. I know you're not there because they never see you. You don't participate. You don't talk. You don't do anything. You're not present because for whatever reason, my own opinions on that, you don't show up around the other 80% of the marketplace. So it's not like the vendor economy is doing anything to drive in more people to buy. Instead, we're all just scraping that same 20%, trying to get them to put their dollars at our event, which means that attendance is starting to drop and it's starting to get split over more events, and people are starting to spend less money, which means that my friends that need to go populate their events with sponsors are struggling. I know this. I'm friends with people who do this for a living at multiple vendors, and a lot of them are struggling to fill their events with vendors now. We don't see how this is a problem, everybody. So how do we fix this entirely fucked up situation that is driving the bulk of the vendors in the space into debt, or forcing them to make poor quality revenue decisions? Because remember, my MSP and my vendor customers, we're not magic. If the dollars go into events to be seen, that means they don't go into research and development and support and features and all the other horse shit you actually want. Right? Like, everybody understands that, right? Like, and without jacking your prices up and locking you all into 3-year commitments that you apparently are allergic to, everybody gets that, right? Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. The money has to come from somewhere. And if it doesn't come from your pocket, paying these vendors higher rates for their products, then it comes out of the vendors' pockets, and they have to be more scrappy with how they spend it. So no one wins from this situation of hemorrhaging more and more money into events. There are a couple of easy solutions that no one's going to go in for. So the first one would be, let's just get rid of most of the events. And I'll just say it right here. If you are a vendor and you think that whatever your product segment is needs its own event because no one's addressing that market, you're a fucking idiot, and you need to stop that shit. I love many of you that have made your own events. I love you dearly. I know some of you in person. You're wonderful companies. Cut that shit out. The other end would just be, to tell everybody to stop paying, basically vote with your dollars. But that's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen because that whole idea of debt versus wealth. Everyone wants to present the illusion in this space, although they are getting tired of it, want to present the illusion of the space that they are living a comfortable MSP or vending lifestyle. They don't want to have to be seen as not going to things. It's sort of the mental kung fu power of subtle peer pressure. So the industry is driving itself more into debt in this area. So that's probably not going to solve it either. Instead, what I think we need to do is a different kind of voting with our dollars. Events need to start costing MSPs more, and they need to start costing vendors less. If we go back to the math we were doing a little while ago, where we said at 12 events a year for startup tier was $168,000 a year spend. Let's just wave that away for a minute. And the $1 million a year spend for people who are lunatic spending, let's wave that away. The two bookends we have here then, at a bronze to a gold level average, is about $350,000 a year spend all the way up to about $800,000 a year spend. That's roughly the bookends that we're moving between for spend. And now we figure that events typically, as we said before, either fall in for-profit or completely non-profit, and then there's a spectrum in between. I think the only way we're going to solve all of this is the non-profit and for-profit need to die. Unless you are running a completely and truly non-profit event that is 100% covered by some sort of membership fee or something like that everybody's already going to buy anyways. A good example of that is CompTIA. Unless it's something like that. And on the for-profit side, Listen, I'm not trying to besmirch anybody's hustle here. If you're making money from an event, good for you. But I don't think we need to be at a for-profit level where we're generating 3-4x on these events on that side either. We need to bring the bookends in. And you might be saying to me, well, Dean, that's not going to work. Exactly. Why do we have free to MSP events, and why do we have insanely expensive to vendor events? That's right. It's that magical thing that a lot of my videos come back to. No one in this space knows how to fucking sell. No one knows what problem they're solving for, and no one knows how to communicate that solution to anyone else. So if I needed to sell something that I didn't know how to sell, how would I do it? Oh, I would either make it free, or I would make someone else with more money pay for it to offset it. Gasp, that's exactly how our event economy works, doesn't it? And here's the thing. If your conference cannot have a viable list of MSPs who are willing to pay a fair price for their ticket to help offset the costs of the event, and you cannot communicate that value proposition where you get a sufficient sign up from the actual consumers of the event, you don't have a viable fucking event. Dear God. Like, how do we not understand this as an industry? If this was any other business, and you couldn't get any customers in the door, so your solution was either to give away the inventory for free and make your suppliers pay for it, or to charge your suppliers so much fucking money to have shit on end caps, guess what would happen? You'd go out of business, because that's not a fucking viable business model. But for some asinine reason, we're allowing it in this space with events. That's the solution, and the shit needs to stop. MSPs should have to pay a ticket to go to events. And I say this as an MSP. And your job is to convince me to come spend my whatever, $800, $1,200 plus travel costs to go to your thing. And if you can't convince me to go and that I'm going to get real value out of it and come back next year and give you money, that's because your event is fucking terrible. It has no value. You should not go over to the vendors and quintuple what they have to pay to offset the fact that you can only get the same 200 people to show up to your circle jerk. Everybody understands that, right? You know what that'll probably mean? That like 80% of the events in the channel will go away because they don't really provide enough value to get people to pay for them. I know, shocking, right? It's almost like the whole thing is a house of fucking cards. Have a great Monday, everybody.